Hey everyone, I hope it's going good. I just wanted to let everyone know that I am working on my 5,000 subscriber special video. For that, I'm going to be ranking all 11 mainline Dragon Quest games, so look forward to that. But today, I am going to share with you the interview that Famitsu did with both Dragon Quest creator Yuji Horii and more recent Final Fantasy creator Yoshinori Kitase. Yuji Horii, of course, as many of you know, is the creator of the Dragon Quest franchise. He was born in 1954 and created Dragon Quest way back in 1986. Since then, he's been developing games for over 40 years, with his latest works being Dragon Quest 1 and 2 HD2 Remake, and then, of course, the upcoming Dragon Quest VII Reimagined. He was honored by receiving the Order of the Rising Sun just last year in 2025. And Yoshinori Kitase was born in 1966. He's a director at Square Enix and has been involved in the Final Fantasy series since Final Fantasy V and was the director of Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VIII. Since then, he's been involved as the producer since Final Fantasy X, and in recent years has been producing the Final Fantasy VII Remake series. If you enjoy Dragon Quest and JRPG content, please remember to like, subscribe, turn notifications to all so you don't miss the next video. If you want to help out a ton, please be sure to hype the video if you're on mobile. And without further ado, let's get into the interview. Both Yuji Horii and Kitase go on to talk about how they may have met once before during the making of Chrono Trigger. Kitase, however, isn't sure whether he stayed at the hotel or if he was actually in the meetings with Yuji Horii, Sakaguchi, and Akira Toriyama during the work on Chrono Trigger. Kitase does, however, remember taking some video while he was down in the United States when they were working on Chrono Trigger, and shares some of that video with Yuji Horii, which is kind of cool. Yuji Horii then asks if Kitase can send him the video after this interview, but they still aren't entirely sure if they ever actually spoke in person until now. The first question by Famitsu is they're wanting to know if there's any entertainment content, especially games that influenced the two of them before they became game developers. Yuji Horii said that he said this in various places, but both Wizardry and Ultima were what inspired him, especially Wizardry. He's really into that. He went to an event called Apple Fest, which is when he found out there were games like Wizardry and Ultima. He ended up buying them, started playing them, and became obsessed with them. The reason he went to Apple Fest was, of course, as a reward for being selected in the first Game Hobby Program contest, which Enix was running at the time. If you want to check out the backstory of how the Dragon Quest team all came together and kind of the development process of the original Dragon Quest, I did do a video on that, so check that bad boy out right here on the channel after this one. Let's continue. How about Kitase? Kitase said he actually got into the industry by playing games made by Yuji Horii. He was a student when Dragon Quest III came out and remembers going to the video game store in Shinjuku, waiting in a gigantic line that was forming on release date. He had to take the early train so he could get in line as soon as possible. Yuji Horii said he actually went by those game shops in Shinjuku because he wanted to see it for himself, and he saw tons of people lined up in the cold, and he felt terrible. Kitase kind of just laughed it off and said, yeah, it was a big deal in the news at the time. The next question Famitsu asked was, what forms of media affected you outside of gaming? Yuji Horii said, I originally wanted to be a manga artist, so manga was the first thing that influenced me, especially Osamu Tezuka's time leap works. He said, I love going back in time and stuff. I find myself watching TV dramas like that too, in a work called The Mysterious Boy. It's a story about a protagonist who can stop time, but there are many things that happen while he stops time. It was so imaginative and exciting. From there, I studied a lot of things like sci-fi and the fourth dimension. It was before the time of Doraemon, Nobunaga's Chef, and Jinjin, so it was quite interesting. Kitase said he was 10 years old and affected by Star Wars. He said it's because they were a massive hit during his generation. Yuji Horii then laughed and kind of referenced that Kitase and the Final Fantasy series has made direct reference to that Star Wars influence, and Kitase said that's right. In the case of the Final Fantasy series, he was at first focused on visuals, and since he liked Star Wars, he hoped he can contribute to Final Fantasy in terms of that visual production, because that's what he loved so much about the Star Wars series. He also learned a lot about how to build up a story and then reach some kind of a climax, like the Star Wars movies. Famitsu then asked, originally Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy were big RPGs made by different rival companies. So what was their impression of each other back at that time? And were you guys conscious of it? Yuji Horii said, Final Fantasy came out after I made the Famicom version of Dragon Quest, so I was somewhat aware of it. When I actually played it, I thought things like, the game balance is pretty tight, but I'm definitely going to die soon, but I was having fun playing it. We were definitely conscious of them being our rivals. When asked the same question, Kitase laughed and said, my position was not great enough to call Dragon Quest my rival. Of course, as a company called Square at the time, they would have viewed it as a rival, and since Final Fantasy was behind in the numbering itself, they were in a position to follow it numerically as well. So the higher-ups definitely saw Dragon Quest and Enix as a rival. Kitase went on to say, in my position, I was playing as a fan even before I joined the company, so I respect that. However, the thing is that Yuji Horii was known for putting out a great product, so it was always a big deal when the Dragon Quest games came out. Everyone was always excited and saying, Dragon Quest is awesome. So some people were definitely worried about that, and people working on Final Fantasy were always worried what the next Dragon Quest was going to be like and how it would compare to the next Final Fantasy. Yuji Horii then said, I was also a bit worried. However, what I thought was different was that in Final Fantasy, the main character talks a lot. Dragon Quest is a drama which you are the main character and experience it, but in Final Fantasy, it's a story in which you watch the main character. I played Final Fantasy VII a long time ago, but I don't remember much about it. Kitase said, it's been almost 30 years already, but yeah, Dragon Quest has basically the same protagonist and player throughout the entire series in some ways. However, in Final Fantasy, you and the protagonist will be in a different mental state. In that case, they both deliver kind of a different experience. They then kind of went on to talk about how in Dragon Quest, they didn't really have cutscenes and all that stuff. So when a party member was dead or in the coffin or whatever, they would still be in the coffin whenever moments would play out in the story. Whereas in Final Fantasy, they were just kind of like knocked out. So the characters would still show up in the cutscenes. And as an aside, that's something I never really thought about until now. It's kind of funny that they brought this up. And Kitase said, yeah, that's certainly true. From inside the story of the game's creation, it's clear whether this character will be there at that time or not. So if the character's in the party, whether they're alive or unconscious or not, they always end up in the cutscenes because they're part of that part of the story. Kitase also went on to say that it's really strange and something that he never really thought about before. Yuji Horii then said, in Final Fantasy the main character talks so the story can move along somewhat easily, but in Dragon Quest the main character doesn't talk, so the story kind of goes on around the hero. Kitase then said, this is a bit of a digression from Final Fantasy, but Chrono Trigger is relatively similar to Dragon Quest in that aspect. Kitase said that having a silent protagonist is definitely something that he wouldn't be able to replicate, and that if he tried, he would probably end up having to give up on it. It's just difficult to tell a story that way, he says. The next question asked by Famitsu was, what were your favorite rivals' work? So we asked Yuji Horii, what is your favorite numbered title in the Final Fantasy series? And your memories of it. Yuji Horii said, I really liked Final Fantasy X. The voices just came in and the cinematics were absolutely stunning. Yuna's dance was amazing, and that's when I thought, this is absolutely the pinnacle of Final Fantasy. Kitase kind of piped in and said, exactly as Yuji Horii said, ever since Final Fantasy VII, there was a direction I was aiming for saying, this is what I want Final Fantasy to be. Despite there being no voice acting in Final Fantasy VII, they really focused on the cinematics and telling their stories with these cinematic cutscenes. And since they felt like they kind of reached the pinnacle of storytelling in cutscenes, they really wanted to implement the voice acting that can add to that aspect even more. Kitase said he's very grateful that Yuji Horii has given Final Fantasy X such praise. He also said a great thing at the time was digital creators would create everything on their computers, so they feel like they're kind of cut off from the mainstream and they're just living in their little nerdy world. But with the inclusion of voice actors, they feel like their work was really expanded to the masses, to the mainstream, as it brought in the power of actors who weren't in just the computer or video game development world for the first time. There was a joy and pride in their work because they were now looked at more as a serious storytelling medium with the hiring of voice actors playing these characters. They then asked Kitase, what is your favorite numbered Dragon Quest title? Kitase said his favorite was Dragon Quest V, and loved the whole marriage aspect about it. He also asked, where did you guys come up with the idea of choosing between multiple different brides and having a meaningful marriage be a part of the story in a video game? Kitase was then asked which bride he chose, and he said, it was Bianca back then, but now I think it's probably Flora, also known as Nera, in the West. I thought that was amazing too. After all, life changes you throughout the years. It's amazing how a game could be designed in a way that changes the way you think about it depending on your age. Yuji Horii said people are still always talking about the marriage feature in Dragon Quest V, and said that a lot of people had a tough time deciding. And when kind of re-asked why Yuji Horii decided that he wanted to add marriage as an aspect to the game, Yuji Horii said he just wanted to make a game where you experience a life. So you're a child, and then you become an adult, you get married, and then you become a parent. And he really wanted to make a JRPG that had those aspects to it, and that's how he ended up coming up with the idea of having marriage and a choice between multiple different brides. Kitase said there's no RPG that can beat Dragon Quest V. Yuji Horii then said, basically I thought everyone was going to choose Bianca, but after listening to various different opinions, I realized that girls tended to choose Flora or Nera quite a bit, and weren't too keen on marrying their childhood friend. Kitase said, I've never spent my youth with a childhood friend, so I always used to choose that one because of my admiration. It's like kind of a childhood promise between friends, but now that I'm older, I kind of see the reality, and that's why I choose Nera. Yuji Horii then laughed and also said, yeah, Nera also gets sent money by her parents. With both a Dragon Quest VII and Final Fantasy VII Remake coming out, Famitsu wanted to ask what both creators thought of the opposing side's 7th entry in the series. Yuji Horii said he thought the setting was very elaborate. He really liked Midgar, Sephiroth, and thought it was interesting that the main character was implanted with kind of like the memories of someone else. He also really liked the rumors of things that you could do in Final Fantasy VII that weren't possible, possibly alluding to the revival of Eris. Kitase was then asked how he enjoyed playing Dragon Quest VII, and said, I like the way that the tablets kind of changed the way people play the game, and how each tablet had its own kind of episode that could be enjoyed. He thought it was very interesting that it was structured kind of like an anthology in a way. So you're doing almost an omnibus of different stories, which is different than how most games' stories are told. And then he kind of mentioned how when Yuji Horii was talking about his love for time travel stories, Kitase said that you could really tell that influence here in Dragon Quest VII. He also said that there's a lot of comparison between Dragon Quest IV and Dragon Quest VII in that they're both kind of based on a chapter system in a way because of the way the tablets work, but Dragon Quest VII is still fairly original in the way it tells its story. While on the topic of the 7th entry in each franchise, Famitsu wanted to ask, what was it like adapting to CD-ROMs, and how did that impact the 7th entry in both of your series? Yuji Horii said, since the move to CD-ROM, I didn't have to worry too much about storage. I could now turn the map around in circles, hide the tablets anywhere on the map, and the reason he chose the tablet system is because in previous entries, there were a lot of different things you could collect. He thought it would be fun to collect maps, and wanted you collecting things to have a lot more impact on the game itself. At the time, he said a lot of people were complaining that the stone tablets were difficult to find, so that's something that they changed in Dragon Quest VII Reimagined. They wanted it to be a lot easier to find those tablets so that they could go on and experience the other stories in the game. Kitase said he kind of agreed with Yuji Horii as far as the CD-ROM format, and how now that the game was on CD-ROM, they could have a 3D world, 3D characters, and the story of an RPG can be told much, much better. For example, a 2D map, you could go to the edge of a castle and there's just nothing there. But in a more 3D world and environment, you can always kind of see stuff that's in the background. There are also things that didn't work in a 3D setting that worked in a 2D setting, and vice versa. Things that worked way better in a 3D setting that didn't work so much in a 2D setting. Kitase actually asked Yuji Horii, was there anything you had to kind of throw away when making Dragon Quest VII? Yuji Horii said, the map was kind of the main focus at the start, so it was kind of hard to lay the map out once once it became three-dimensional. That's why they had to make it so that the camera was further back and you can kind of look at the map from above and get a better sense of direction. And that's also why they wanted you to be able to rotate the camera around so that in town you can kind of find your way around a little bit easier with things being created for a three-dimensional world. It's also why they were able to put stairs and stuff and entrances on the back of buildings. It was fun because it kind of gave the game a new twist. Kitase said in the case of Final Fantasy VII, rotation wasn't possible because they used pre-rendered backgrounds, which was in 3D but could not be rotated. When they were talking about making their worlds more 3D, they thought they would come across too many difficulties, which is why they decided to kind of go with the pre-rendered background style, so it still looks gorgeous and 3D without truly really being 3D. Famitsu said with that constraint you could use perspective to hide things in the distance. Kitase replied, it became clear that this was something that we could do with pre-rendered backgrounds. Yuji Horii said, Dragon Quest VII has been made into a 2-disc set because it allows you to go back to the towns you went to before, so we had the daunting task of having to double all of the data. Kitase said, that's why Final Fantasy was kind of cut off. We put up some barriers and made it impossible to go back to certain towns. Dragon Quest is a lot more thorough. Famitsu said although there was some hesitation due to the increase in discs, there was some discussion about how to use that extra space available, right? Kitase said yeah, however the FMV cutscenes took up a lot of space, so most of the capacity was used for the cutscenes. Yuji Horii said even so, you were able to relax a little and talk to your friends. The reason I chose Maribel to have the kind of personality she does is because I thought it would be more interesting if she could talk. At the time, the word tsundere didn't exist yet, but it became something like the origins of tsundere. I also added a lot of vocations, and I remember struggling with that, kind of revealing the reason why party chat was such a big deal in Dragon Quest VII. You could even party chat in battle in Dragon Quest VII on the PS1, which was something the series did not have. Famitsu then went on to say, however, the basic game system for both games remained the same, and you kept the turn-based command battles. Kitase said, that's right. In terms of battles, the materia system is distinctive. In the planning phases, materia was a spherical object, so we named it the sphere system. However, Sakaguchi at the time said calling it the sphere system is a little bit bland, so they came up with the name materia. Looking back, I think the name materia is easier for players to recognize and has become so iconic that it's not just some fancy way of saying something like the sphere system, which is a testament to Sakaguchi's foresight at the time. And then they kind of joked how with Dragon Quest they have like their job classes and vocations, but they never really came up with a fancy name. And Kitase said with Final Fantasy when they would use job classes, they also just called them job classes and never really came up with a fancy name either. Kitase then asked why Yuji Horii never really came up with a fancy name, and Yuji Horii said, whenever we did come up with a fancy name for the job class system, it just seemed like it was too hard to understand and overcomplicated things, so they just went back to calling it the vocation or class or job class system, as it was just easier for players to understand and recognize. Famitsu then said, I thought the story of both series changed quite a bit in the 7th entry. For example, in Dragon Quest VII, the main character is a fisherman's son. Up until that point, RPG main characters had been heroes. Are there any historical influences on these changes? Yuji Horii said, in the case of Dragon Quest VII, I started with the idea of an ordinary boy, but as we continued to develop the game, I thought this is kind of a bad idea, and added various behind-the-scenes settings as an afterthought. Famitsu then said, did you want to change the situation by starting with a hero? To which Yuji Horii replied, that's right. For example, in Dragon Quest V, this is true. You don't actually become the hero, but your child will become the hero. There are a lot of things to think about. Then in Dragon Quest XI, even though he's the hero, he gets locked up in prison and everyone says that the hero is evil. It's nice to kind of change things up to keep things fresh in the franchise. Kitase then said, for the story of Final Fantasy VII, it was just me, Nojima, and Tetsuya Nomura. The three of us would continue to spin it around, we'd write a bit, and then pass it around, and kind of share ideas as it went on. I personally just wanted Cloud to be a cool heroic type of character. As Yuji Horii mentioned earlier, Cloud was not equal to the player. Maybe that's Nojima's style, but there's a point where the player doesn't know if Cloud was a soldier or was not a soldier. So in a way, it was interesting to play the game with that narrative trick. Famitsu then said, although Cloud was a shadowy protagonist, Dragon Quest VII also took each town's episode quite seriously. To which Yuji Horii replied, that's right, Dragon Quest VII had a lot of dark stories. There were a lot of bad things that happened to people in Dragon Quest VII stories, and a lot of good things. But I wanted to write these stories that don't necessarily all have a happy ending. Famitsu then asked, next let's talk about the upcoming remake. Are there any goals that you set when making this remake? Yuji Horii said that by far the one thing thing they wanted to make sure they fixed was making it easier to find the tablet fragments. He felt it took way too long to find all the fragments to be able to get to the next part in the story. So it's not that we wanted to cut a bunch of content, but there are parts I felt that we should cut. I feel like it makes the game a lot more enjoyable. Famitsu then also brought up how the characters have that doll look to them. Yuji Horii said, I was shown the dolls first, and I thought they were absolutely amazing. So we created the town using polygon graphics, but we took the inspiration from this doll look, and that's how we ended up with the diorama look to the world. I also love dioramas, so I really like the look of the towns and the world map. Famitsu then asked Kitase, what were you thinking about when you made the Final Fantasy VII Remake? Kitase said there were two, and first of all, the battle was an active time battle that was relatively similar to a command battle system. So at the start, we weren't sure if we were or were not going to add action elements to suit the current era. So the first thing that came to mind was maybe let's pick something in the middle. Also for the story and the world itself, we didn't want to leave out any scenes that players had feelings for from the original work, or any parts that we figured were iconic to the original game. It's safe to say that we wanted fans of the original to be satisfied, but also to have new and current players to enjoy it. Kitase then had a question for Yuji Horii. He asked, I have something I wanted to ask Yuji Horii. Many of the new staff members working on Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy have kind of grown up playing these games, so they almost deify Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy. Do you feel you have to be protective over the original content, or do you feel that it's in good hands because of this? Yuji Horii said, I like to give them freedom, but it's nice that they have the respect for the franchise. And Kitase agreed. Yuji Horii then said, in Dragon Quest VII Reimagined, you also have to thoroughly explore and play the first island, and then the rest is up to you, the player. Once you clear one episode, you'll get a general idea of the controls and the balance, so you kind of have an idea of what to do from then on. Famitsu then said, Kitase, you mentioned that you were advised you could make bigger changes to Midgar? To which Kitase replied, if anything, I thought it would be a bad idea to be so tied down to the original work of Final Fantasy VII, and if we stuck to the original too religiously, we would be too limited in the development, and we didn't want it to be that way. Famitsu then asked Yuji Horii what he thought of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Yuji Horii then replied, we're talking about Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy VIIth Entry, but I feel like they look and are made completely different from each other. Dragon Quest VII Reimagined is kind of a cuter look and has a bit more of a sense of humor, whereas in Final Fantasy VII Remake, it's about the devastated city of Midgar and has a more realistic look to it. One of the parts I found more interesting was the scene where Dio from the Gold Saucer appears. I thought they did a good job including a lot of humor there, and I feel like they would have had a good time playing around with the story. It was really fun to experience. I feel like the look of the devastated Midgar was really well done. Famitsu then said, next I would like to discuss the new elements of the remakes. So now we're getting into a little bit of spoiler territory for the Dragon Quest VII Reimagined remake. So if you don't want to hear the spoilers, you've been avoiding most of this stuff and details on the Dragon Quest VII Reimagined game itself, thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like the video, subscribe, turn notifications to all so you don't miss the next video, and hype the video if you haven't yet. It helps so much. And thank you so much for watching. But the next question here, Famitsu said, next I would like to discuss the new elements of the remake. The return of Kiefer in Dragon Quest VII Reimagined was a hot topic. Yuji Horii said, this time an adult Kiefer is coming back. In the original, you just received a letter in the present day. Even back then, I thought that was kind of a bad ending for the character, but nobody else really told me that, so I just kind of left it. And then Yuji Horii and Kitase both kind of laughed it off. Famitsu then said, Final Fantasy VII Remake also has a lot of elements, such as new segments, and characters like Jessie have a bigger role. To which Kitase said, in the case of the Final Fantasy VII Remake series, the original story is a single scenario, but in the remakes, it's presented as a trilogy, and the players come in with requests after each entry. In response to this, we took a lot of feedback from the players and the developers about the next games, how to balance it, and what we should do with the next entry. Famitsu then asked what both Yuji Horii and Kitase thought about multi-platform games. Yuji Horii said, as a creator, I want more people to be able to play my games. It was tough back in the days where a game couldn't be played by everyone on all systems, but that was pretty much the way it was back then. It's kind of strange looking back at it. Now we also try to have a worldwide release with our games, so we have to work on both the English translation and the voice acting in other languages at the same time, which does take a lot more time. Kitase added, previously the hurdles to multi-platform development were high. There are parts where I was trying to take advantage of the hardware at the point and fully optimize the graphics right down to the last minute. The specs on all hardware is increasing now, so no matter which platform you choose, you can kind of get the best quality. I think the best benefit of having a handheld machine or something that can be played by more players is that you don't have to be in the living room at home to play it. In terms of allowing a wide range of people to play it, it's very exciting to see multi-platform development. Famitsu chimed in and said, on the other hand, I think there have been some big changes in development. To which Yuji Horii said, now it's time and cost. On one hand, you can do anything, but if you do all that, it won't get finished. The Famicom version of Dragon Quest was made by just over 10 people at the beginning, and it took about 3 months. But now we have hundreds of staff, and it takes a long time. However, the price of the game doesn't change all that much. Kitase laughed and said, that's true. Also, each platform has different characteristics, so it would be foolish to develop them while simultaneously only supporting one of them. Our biggest motivation is to get as many people to play it as possible. But with doing that, it means the hurdles to development are definitely a bit higher. Famitsu then said, in 2026, Dragon Quest will celebrate its 40th anniversary, and in 2027, Final Fantasy will celebrate its 40th. Although games have evolved in many ways, RPGs remain popular, and I believe this is because they have universal appeal. That's why I recently played Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy for the first time. There are some young users like me, so what do you think is appealing about RPGs that makes them so popular? Yuji Horii says the first attraction is just simply getting stronger. As you gain experience, you'll become stronger. In addition, you can become the main character and enjoy a different life. As with movies and novels, I think it's easier to empathize with games because you have direct control over the characters. You can take whatever road you want. Although Dragon Quest has light rails, I made them with the feeling that it's okay for them to come off every once in a while. So it's fun to have that extra bit of freedom. I think games are loved because they allow you to have so many different ways of having fun. I also think that games are a way to relate to other people. Like, I went there, I did this in that area. Oh, I couldn't find that. Where did you find that? In a sense, I think it's a fun pastime. Kitase said, I think it's because RPGs are unique. When I announced and spoke to various media outlets around the world, I realized that Final Fantasy VII is nearly 25 years old. So the user interface and graphics are outdated in today's world. As for the story though, it hasn't changed much. Of course, the dialogue has been changed to make it easier to understand in today's world, but I haven't changed the underlying storyline. I hope current players will understand and enjoy that. I think the fact that it stands the test of time is something that's just very RPG-like. Yuji Horii said, in the past, sometimes developers were their own enemies, but recently I was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun, and was recognized by the national government. I'm kind of a first-generation RPG creator, but I think this gives hope to young people. Eventually, I kind of hope that YouTubers and cosplayers will also start to receive awards, and I think that would be fun. Famitsu then finished up by saying, I hate to do this, but it's about time. So please leave an appealing comment to finish with. Kitase said, I had a great time talking with Yuji Horii today. Final Fantasy VII Remake Integrate is available now on Nintendo Switch 2 and Xbox Series X and S. The game boosts function and other features have been enhanced to make it easier to play, so please enjoy it. Yuji Horii said, this was the first time I'd spoken to Kitase, but since we're kind of connected by working on the 7th installment of our respective series, we were able to talk about a lot of things in common, and it was a lot of fun. Dragon Quest VII Reimagined will be released on February 5th, 2026. Please look forward to it. So yeah, that was the interview done by Famitsu. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys took a lot of information from that. Let me know your thoughts on the interview itself. Let me know your thoughts on the video. Let me know what you're most looking forward to in Dragon Quest VII Reimagined, as well as the third entry in the Final Fantasy VII Remake series. Thank you guys so much for watching. Again, if you haven't yet, please remember to like the video, subscribe, turn notifications to all, and hype it. If you want to see the origins of Dragon Quest I, please check out my other video on that topic. And in the same spirit of comparing both franchises and each entry in both franchises, check out my series where I take each iteration of the Dragon Quest series and put it up against that same iteration of the Final Fantasy series. I've done Dragon Quest versus Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest II versus Final Fantasy II, Dragon Quest III versus Final Fantasy III, and of course, it just came out a little while ago, Dragon Quest IV versus Final Fantasy IV. So check those videos out as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.